Hello, it is I, the comfortable narrator, and for today's reading, we are reading Anthony Horowitz, The Devil and His Boy. Some interesting, an interesting backstory on this book. It was given to me by my history professor, and it was one of the books that I originally started my previous channel on. Yes, that's right. This is actually my second attempt at these narrational videos, and I'm starting this up again because I have more confidence in my voice. And I have more confidence in general because there's more people in my life who are there for me, who are looking out for me, and I genuinely feel more comfortable doing this for you guys. Also, I would like to point out that I do apologize in advance if there's any disturbances while I'm reading. I currently have a few issues and family matters and friends going through stuff, so I have to be on standby for them because in life we should always put our family before anything. So now I'm going to continue the reading, and again, this is Anthony Horowitz, The Devil and His Boy. As I always do, I give all credit to the publisher, the author, and everybody and anybody in between. Everybody who went in, who put all the work that it took into producing this piece of art. Chapter 1. Oh, hold on. Chapter 1. The Stone of Vision. It was just before midnight when Queen Elizabeth slipped out of bed and went in search of her musician. Although she had allowed her ladies-in-waiting to lead her into the bedroom and help her undress more than an hour before, she hadn't even tried to sleep. Part of the trouble, of course, was being Queen of England. She could still feel the crown on her head, even when she wasn't wearing it. There was so much to think about, so much to do. But the real problem was her bed. It was a huge, four-postered thing with no fewer than 5 quilts. The first was silk, the next velvet, then there was a gold one and a silver one, and finally, on top, a quilt embroidered with a rather gloomy picture of the Sermon on the Mount. The quilts had been given to her by the Spanish ambassador, the French ambassador, the Dutch ambassador, the German ambassador, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. And she had to use them all so that she did not give offense to any one of them. The result was that even on the coldest winter nights she was always much too hot. For a moment she stood in the middle of the room and glanced out of the window. There was a full moon that night, which pleased the Queen. She knew that the magician would like it. Somehow his spells always worked better when there was a moon. And this one seemed huge. A perfect white circle hanging in the darkness. Her eyes traveled down and she saw the Thames, ash-white, as it twisted through the city of London. Everything was silent. The Queen nodded. This was the right time. She crossed the room to a tapestry that covered an entire wall. The tapestry showed a lion being hunted, and when she was young, the snarling face with its ugly eyes had given her nightmares. But she was an elderly woman now, 60 years old, and how could she have nightmares when she hardly ever slept? The tapestry was suspended from a rail, and she pulled it aside to reveal a bare brick wall with no visible door or window. At the far end of the wall, over a bookshelf, there was a metal hook. Without hesitating, the Queen went over to it and turned it. There was a click, and the whole section of the wall swung inward on a hidden hinge to reveal a jagged opening and a spiral staircase leading down. Grey cobwebs hung in the air. A fat, black spider, frightened by the light from the bedroom, tumbled down the brickwork and then scuttled along the floor, disappearing into the shadows. The Queen lifted a candle from her room and started forward, under the warmth of the bedroom. The stairs were very cold. A drop twisted around her ankles and slithered up her legs. The candle in her hand flickered and her shadow seemed to jump away, tugging at her as if it could pull her back upstairs. For a moment she wondered if this was a good idea. She could still turn back, go to bed, and forget all about it. The Queen was afraid, but she remembered now what she had done, what she had been forced to do, exactly 40 years ago. 40 years of silence. It was time for it to end. She continued down. A moth, attracted by the light, flew into her face. Its feathery wings brushed against her lips, and she gasped aloud. Her hand banged against the wall, and she almost dropped the candle. She stopped for a minute, catching her breath. Then, gripping the candle more tightly, she followed the stairs to their end, passing through an archway, and along a corridor where the ceiling curved low over her head, as if groaning under the weight of the great palace 100 yards above. She had reached a door made of thick planks of wood, bound together with iron so low that she had to bend to open it. It reminded her of the door of one of her own dungeons. Her hand found a silver ring, and she turned it, the metal cold against her skin. On the other side, a warm yellow glow and the faint smell of rosemary welcomed her into a small, circular chamber. The door swung shut behind her as she went in. "Good evening, Queen." "You were expecting me, wizard." "Oh, yes. I knew you intended to visit me before you had even decided it yourself. Sit down." Nobody else would have dared to talk to Queen Elizabeth in this way. For a start, she could have been called Your Royal Highness, or Your Majesty, and nobody ever told her what to do, not even so much as to sit down. But the person seated in the high, wood-backed chair was no ordinary man. Dr. John Dee was 66 years old, but looked much older. Having a white mustache and a white beard that came to a point about halfway down his chest, he wore a long black robe and a black cape that could have been painted onto his head. His eyes were brown, a strange watery brown, the color of melted chocolate. There was a great cat, half asleep on his lap, and he occasionally stroked it with a long, elegant finger. Dr. Dee spoke with a Welsh accent, so rather more remarkably did the cat. "You know why I have come," the Queen said. "Of course I do." Do you know everything, wizard?" Dr. Dee shook his head. "I know many things, Queen, and my stone of vision tells me more. But only God knows everything. I am just a man." "Can you tell me when I am going to die?" the Queen asked. The musician hesitated. His eyes narrowed, and he seemed unsure what to say. Then the cat arched its back, stretched its legs, and suddenly opened its quiet, brilliant, emerald eyes. "You will die," the cat said, "when you stop breathing." There was silence in the room. For a long minute, the Queen gazed at the cat. Then she smiled. "It is a good answer," she said. "But that is not the question you came to ask," Dr. Dee muttered. "No." Suddenly the Queen was nervous. Her fingers closed on a gold locket she was wearing around her neck. She had taken off all her other jewelry for bed, but this locket never left her. It was part of her. "I wish to know about him," she said. "Why now?" "Today is his birthday." She fell silent for a moment, then said, "I think of him all the time, wizard. I know I can never see him, but I still wonder about him, whether he is dead or alive." Dr. Dee stroked the cat. "I can tell you what you want to know," he said. "But I have to warn you now, Queen. It might be better not to ask. Magic has a nasty way of changing things. You cast a spell, you ask for secret knowledge, and before you know it, you have opened a barrel of worms. Or perhaps something worse than worms." "I still have to know," the Queen insisted. "Enough of this, wizard. You have known me long enough to know what my mind is made up. Do your magic. Tell me what you see." "She's making a mistake," the cat murmured. "Hush!" Dr. Dee struck the cat, then lifted it up and set it to one side. There was a low table between Dr. Dee and the Queen, with a number of objects scattered across the table. There were the tools of the musician's trade. There were 3 or 4 old books, so old that the others seemed to be sinking into the thick, yellowish pages. There were 2 candles and a tapering wand. Between them lay what looked like an ordinary piece of silvery grey stone, about the size of a dinner plate. Dr. Dee picked it up and cradled it in his hands. "I will need something of his," Dr. Dee said in a low voice. Once again the Queen's fingers reached for the locket around her neck, but this time she took it and drew it over her head. nestling it in the palm of one hand. She opened it with the other. Inside the locket was a miniature portrait of a man, and opposite it, a locket of light brown hair. The queen gazed at the hair for what seemed like an eternity. Then let it fall onto the table. "It is all that I have left." "I have," she said. "Are you prepared to lose it?" There was a flicker of anger in the queen's eyes. "Do what you have to do," she said. Dr. D picked up the hair and laid it on the stone. He cupped his hands around the stone without touching it, his eyes fixed on the stone as if it were trying to look through it. The queen leaned forward as she did so. The lock of hair moved. She thought that it had been caught in a draught, but then she realized that the stone had become hot, and that it was the heat that was causing the effect. The air above the stone was shimmering. The color of the stone was changing from gray to white, and then to metallic silver. "No," the word escaped the queen's lips as it gasped. The lock of hair had burst into flame. Now the flickering pieces rose into the air, twisted, and disappeared. The surface of the stone was no longer rough or remotely stony. It had become a mirror, but as Dr. D looked into it, it did not show his reflection. His name was Robert. The magician's eyes were focused in the distance, and the queen knew that he was seeing things outside the room, outside and far away. "Yes, Robert." Even uttering his name was a knife wound. She had never done it before. "Tell me, wizard, is he alive?" A long silence, and then, "No, queen, he is dead." The queen fell back in her chair, covering her eyes with her hands. Somehow she had always expected it, but like all bad news, it had lost none of its power to hurt. Dr. D was still gazing into the mirror that had been a stone, and there was a look of puzzlement on his face. "What is it?" the queen demanded. "I don't know." And then, as if a cloud had parted and the sun had broken through, the magician looked up. "He had a son," he said. "What?" "Robert is dead, but his son is still alive." The queen gripped the sides of her chair. "Where is he? What is he called? What do you know about him?" "He is far from here. I cannot see his name." The stone was getting hotter and hotter. The very air inside the chamber was beginning to burn. "Try! You must! Try!" "No, all I can see is a castle and a pig. It is difficult." Dr. D waved a hand over the stone, clearing the smoke. "The pig is outside the castle and over the boy." "He is still a boy? How old is he?" 13. The castle..." Dr. D frowned. "They are building chimneys on the castle. Strange-looking chimneys. I can see the boy limping past the castle, and he's looking at the chimneys, and..." "Why is he limping?" "Because of the pig." "Why must your answers be so mysterious, wizard?" "Where is the boy? If you can't tell me his name, at least tell me where he is." But before Dr. D could reply, there was a sudden crackle, like a musket going off. At the same time, the mirror shattered, 1,000 cracks exploding across its surface. Then the cracks faded, and a second later, the stone was exactly as it had been, lying flat and ordinary on the table. "That is all I can tell you, Queen." Dr. D picked up the stone. It was quite cool to the touch. "But you have spies and men of intelligence. It should be enough." "A castle, strange chimneys, and a pig. Another of your wretched riddles. Wizard, where do I even start?" "Firmingham." The cat, which had been quite forgotten during all this, leapt onto Dr. D's lap. "They're building chimneys on Firmingham Castle." "How do you know?" the queen asked. The cat shrugged. "A little bird told me," it remarked. "And then I ate the little bird." "Firmingham in Suffolk." The queen got to her feet. "Only 4 or 5 days from here. You have done well, wizard. You have my things, and will have much more." The queen left, coming back up the secret staircase to her bedroom. She was still awake when the sun rose above the thatched roofs and wooden houses of London, and the first horses stumbled along the rough pitted tracks that were the city's roads. The year was 1593. The queen, of course, was Elizabeth I, and she was already planning the course of events that would change one boy's life forever, and with it the entire history of the country she ruled. That's the end of chapter 1. Just real quick, guys, I like how the author was setting this up with the wizard and the attention to detail that he was doing. It was beautiful, and I really like it when how they introduce the setting to you. Going over the history. See, they answered some things, but not a lot of things. See, they give you the scraps on a plate, and they save the main dish until you get more in the book. And that's with any book, so they can entice you. I just like this book so far. Now let's begin chapter 2. The Pig's Head. It was raining in Farmingham, a cold, grey December rain that dripped and trickled into every corner and wiped away the color of everything it touched. The streets were so full of puddles that there were more puddles than street, with only a few patches of brown mud here and there to remind you that the place had once been built on dry land. The 2 moats surrounding Farmingham Castle were full to overflowing. The town gardens and bowling green had disappeared. The inn stood just outside the town, next to a large swamp. It was a squat, dark, evil-smelling place, with rotting timbers and mouldy walls. It had few windows. Glass was too expensive, but the noise of singing and the smell of roasting meat seeped through the thatched roof and chimney. An inn sign swung in the wind. The sign showed the head of a pig, severed from its body, for that was the inn's name. Ah! The Pig's Head, Farmingham. Proprietors Sebastian and Henrietta Slope. That explains the title of this chapter, The Pig's Head. At about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a young boy came out of the inn, carrying a bucket. Despite the weather, he was wearing only the lightest of clothes. A shirt open at the neck, a waistcoat that was too short for him, a pair of trousers that flapped around his ankles. He had neither shoes nor socks. His bare feet splashed in the mud as he went to draw water from the well. The boy was about 12 or 13 years old. Nobody knew or cared exactly when he had been born. He had long reddish-brown hair, pale skin, and bright, intelligent blue eyes. He was painfully thin. His rags seemed to hang off his shoulders without actually touching his body. And there was a bruise on the side of his cheek, the size of a man's fist. He lowered the bucket into the well, gripping the handle that groaned rustily as it turned. His fingers were usually long and slender. The boy's name was Thomas Falconer. That, at least, would be the name they'd carve on his gravestone when starvation or the plague carried him away. For now, they simply called him Tom. He was about to lift the bucket out of the well when a sound made him turn. A man had appeared, a traveler, on horseback, his body lost in the folds of a dark cloak, his face hidden by his hat. The horse was a great black stallion, with a white blaze on its chest. Steam was snorting from its nostrils as it jerked forward, its hooves striking angrily in the mud. It came to a halt, and the rider swung himself effortlessly down. Mud had splattered his brown leather boots and the bottom of his cloak. He had evidently been riding for some time. "Boy!" the man called out. Forgetting the bucket, Tom ran forward to obey. "Yes, my lord." "Take the horse to the stable. See that he's watered and fed. If any harm comes to him, you'll answer for it." The man dragged his luggage from behind his saddle and handed the reins to Tom. He was about to turn away, but suddenly he stopped, and for a moment Tom found himself being examined by 2 narrow grey eyes and a dark, weathered face. "What is your name, boy?" the man demanded. "Tom, my lord." Tom was surprised. People seldom took any notice of him. "How long have you worked here, Tom?" "All my life, my lord. Ever since I was able to work." The rider stared at Tom as if trying to read something in his face. "Your parents own this building?" he asked. Tom shook his head. "My parents are dead," he said. "Who were they? Do you know?" It was one question too many. Travelers often passed through Framingham on their way to the ports at Warwick or Ipswich, but they came as strangers, and that was how they left. It was the unwritten law. In an uncertain world, it could be dangerous to give too much information about yourself. Tom's lips clamped shut. The man seemed to understand. "Take care of the horse, Tom," he said, and walked into the inn. The inn was crowded, and the fire a distant red glimmer, behind so many huddled bodies. Thick smoke coiled upward from the hearth, from the tallow candles on the mantel, and from pipes clenched in the teeth of men and women too. Two more boys, older and better fed than Tom, were bustling in and out of the kitchen, carrying wooden trenchers of meat and bread, somehow forcing their way through the great tangle to find the tables beyond. Someone somewhere was playing a fiddle, but the sound was almost drowned out by the shouting, arguing, laughing, and drunken singing of the guests. The landlord noticed the new arrival the moment the door opened, but then he had the sort of eyes that noticed everything. This was Sebastian Slope. He was a small, nervous man who never quite recovered from the pox that had ravaged his skin and eaten away part of his nose. He had tried to grow a beard and mustache to hide the damage, but unfortunately the hair, as well as being bright orange, was thin and uneven, sprouting in one part of his face but not in another, with the result that he looked as if he had been horribly injured, perhaps by a musket at close range. Rubbing his pale white hands together, he approached the new arrival, who was standing there waiting, water dripping from his cloak. "Good evening, my lord. Welcome, welcome to the Pig's Head." Slope's teeth had long ago rotted away, all but a couple of them, and he now found it easier to speak through what was left of his nose. His voice was thin and high-pitched. If a rat could talk, it would probably sound much the same. "What can I fetch for you, my lord? A pint of finest ale, a delicious supper, a nice leg of mutton, or perhaps a specialty of the house, a potato. Have you ever tried a potato, my lord? It is quite new and the most remarkable thing." "I need a room for the night," the traveler interrupted. Of course. We can provide you with the best linen sheets, and only 6 of our guests have slept on them since they were last washed." "I'll have a bed with clean sheets, and I'll eat some lamb. Yes, and a rabbit too. Mushrooms, some cheese, and beer, not ale." "Beer? Yes. Will you have the meal in your chamber, my lord, or at the common table? It'll be 6 pence downstairs and 8 pence up. But if you have it up, perhaps we could arrange for one of our kitchen maids to keep you company?" Slope twisted half his face into a secretive smile, and winked so many times that it looked as if his eye might fall out. The stranger frowned. "I'll eat down here. You do us all a privilege and enjoy, my lord." Slope smiled, but at the same time a strange gleam had come into his eyes, so that he looked both servile and sinister at the same time. "Have you come far, my lord?" "From London," the stranger replied. "And returning so soon?" "Tomorrow." This was the information the innkeeper had been angling for. He swallowed once, his Adam's apple performing a somersault in his scrawny throat. "Henrietta!" he called out. "Henny!" A moment later a tiny woman with grey, straggly hair hurried out of the smoke. This was Henrietta Slope, and although to look at she could have been Sebastian's grandmother, she was in fact his wife. She too had caught the pox in 17 years' marriage. It was the only thing her husband had given her. The disease had attacked her lips, which had shriveled away so that when she smiled she was forced to use her teeth. "We have a guest," Sebastian said. "A guest? How lovely! And a gentleman," Henrietta curtsed twice. "Have you ordered your food, my lord? The food here is a delight. We have only had 9 cases of food poisoning since our new cook started." I've ordered, the traveler muttered. He has indeed, Sebastian agreed. Lamb, mushrooms, cheese, and rabbit. Rabbit, Henrietta agreed, liplessly. Fresh today. It couldn't be fresher. In fact, I strangled it myself. Thank you. The traveler seemed to be in a hurry to get away from this odd couple. But suddenly he leaned across the bar and drew them closer to him. I was speaking just now to that boy outside, he began. Tom? Sebastian's face darkened. If he offended your lordship, I'll throw him down the well. That boy's useless, Henrietta shrieked. He's worse than useless. He's a drip. He's a damp patch. A dead worm. He hasn't offended me, the traveler interrupted. I am merely interested in him. Where did you find him? Sebastian glanced at his wife, then leered at the new guest. Are you interested in buying him? He asked. We might sell him, Henrietta simpered. Although, of course, we'd miss him. He works very well for us. A very hard worker. Very fit. She seemed to have completely forgotten what she had been saying only a few moments before. Where did you find him? He was an orphan. Henrietta's eyes filled with tears. I have 2 sons of my own, my lord. I took him in out of the goodness of my heart. She tapped her chest, which seemed too thin and hollow to contain any heart at all. We look after him in return for a few light tasks about the house. What of his parents? The traveler asked, becoming more interested by the second. They worked up at the castle, Sebastian replied. The father fell off a horse and broke his neck. The mother died, giving birth to him. He came into the world with nothing, and but for Miss S. and myself, nothing is all he'd have now. The traveller's eyes narrowed, and for a moment he said nothing. He was obviously deep in thought, but then he shook his head and straightened up. Send me my food as soon as possible, he said, and went and sat at the nearest table. Sebastian Slope watched the man as he took his place, then slipped through a door and into the kitchen. Here there was a second huge fire with a rather angry-looking pig on a spit, being turned by a fat, sweating cook with dirty hands and a runny nose. Henrietta had followed her husband in, and now he drew her to one side, standing over a huge cauldron of soup that was slowly conggealing. What do you think, my precious? He asked. Rich? Henrietta murmured. Definitely rich. So I thought. Sebastian tried to pick his nose, remembered it wasn't there, and bit his nail absent-mindedly instead. Did you notice the cloak linen with velvet, my jewel? And the boots? Henrietta nodded. I think this is one for Ratsy, she muttered. Yes, Sebastian said. Ratsy will like this one. You had better summon the boy. But at the very moment the outer door opened, and Tom came back into the kitchen. It began to rain more heavily, and water dripped out of his hair, running down the sides of his neck. He was carrying the bucket, full now and heavy. Where have you been? Sebastian swung a lazy arm and slapped the back of his hand across Tom's head. Lazying again, I'll be bound. Henrietta swung her arm too, only harder. I'm sorry, Tom cried out. A gentleman came. He told me to see to his horse. Yes, Sebastian leaned closer. Tom cowered away, but the landlord was smiling. What sort of horse does he ride? A stallion. Black, with a white mark. Valuable. Tom hesitated. He knew what was about to happen, and thought about lying, but it was no good. The Slopes would know. They always did. Yes, he said. Sebastian grabbed him by the collar and drew him so close that his lips almost touched the boy's ears. You're to go into the wood, he whispered. Find Ratsy. Tell him we have a mark. The London Road. Tomorrow. But it's dark. It's raining. Are you arguing with me? Sebastian hadn't raised his voice, but his grip had tightened and his eyes, dark to begin with, had gone almost black. No, Master Slope. Then be off with you, to the burnt oak, and if he isn't there, wait for him to come. Tom ran out, slamming the door behind him. Sebastian and Henrietta Stubb watched him go. "You're too kind to that child," Henrietta sighed. "I am soft-hearted. I know it," Sebastian agreed. "I wonder why our guest was so interested in him." Henrietta scratched her head and sighed, as a lump of hair fell into the soup. Her disease was definitely getting worse. Sebastian considered for a moment. "I suppose we'll never know," he replied. Husband and wife kissed each other, gray, lipless teeth onto gray, pock-marked flesh. Then they left the kitchen and went back into the inn. That's the end of chapter 2. Hey guys, notice the attention to detail when the couple had kissed. Like, he's really painting them as disgusting, vile, and just horrible people. This couple was just the worst of the worst. And he's doing a superb job at it. Just with describing how they look. First of all, the way they ended up looking, that's one thing. But their actions will always speak louder than their words. And their actions are absurd and horrible. And just notice the diction that the author uses. Gray, pock-marked flesh. And for those of you who don't know, diction is the words that are used to emphasize meaning or feeling in the text that the author will use. There's a lot of symbolism, and if you ever have to annotate this book, I mean, you won't have that much of a hard time with it. Just really take your time and enjoy it. It's a nice little read. Now, moving on to the next chapter. Chapter 3. Gamali Ratzi. After he had left the Pig's Head, Tom climbed up the hill and back into the town center. It had stopped raining, and the clouds had parted enough to allow a slice of moonlight to cut through. Tom was grateful for it. Without the moon, he would have had to make the journey in almost pitch blackness, for the only other light that came from the candles burning behind the windows of the houses, and with the high price of wax, there were few enough of them. He paused through the market square, skirting around an old crooked building that stood in the middle. This was called the Market's Cross, and Tom knew that there was a schoolroom on the upper floor. Not that he had ever been inside it. He had never been to school, not even for a day. He couldn't read or write anything more than the 3 letters of his own name. Tom was an orphan who had never known his parents. He was beaten and bullied every day. He was half-starved and owned nothing more than the rags he was wearing. And yet, despite all this, he wouldn't have described himself as unhappy. For a start, he had never once been outside farming hand, so he had nothing with which to compare his own life. At the same time, he had listened to travelers staying at the inn, and knew that there were poor people and hungry people all over England, so why should things be any different for him? At least he had a roof over his head, even if it was only a stable roof that leaked in the rain. He had plenty of scraps and leftovers to eat. The Sloats might beat him, but so far they hadn't broken anything. All in all, things could be worse. Ahead of him, Farmingham Castle loomed, its walls dark and ancient against the night sky. Tom had heard about the great banquets and tournaments that had been taking place there years ago. But that was all in the past now. The castle was crumbling. Cracks had appeared in the brickwork, and weeds had quickly sprouted in the cracks. The ridiculous twisting chimneys that had been added to the battlements were just its final humiliation. Tom hurried around it, keeping the town ditch on his left. The town seemed to end very suddenly. The road became a track. The track grew more and more uneven, and then he was walking across a bumpy field with a black skeletal forest shrinking up ahead. Thank you guys, I'm sorry. I have to do these recordings all at once, in one sitting. So it's difficult on me and it's difficult on you guys. I apologize. Alright. Most of the trees had lost their leaves. The forest in winter was a cold, foreboding place. As Tom continued, branches twisted and interlocked above his head, while roots formed tangled knots beneath him. The glistening tree trunks were like huge bars. With every step he took, he felt himself being swallowed up by a vast, living cage. Somewhere far away, an animal howled in the darkness. One of the dogs from the village? Or something worse? Tom knew it was unlikely that wolves would come so far south at this time of the year, but even so, he found himself quickening his pace. He had been this way many times, and soon found what he was looking for. A tree shaped like a Y, a rough slope covered in white pebbles in a circular clearing, and there on the far side an old oak tree that had been hit by lightning. Split in half and burned coal black. This was the burned oak to which Sebastian Slope had referred. This was where Ratsey would be found. Ratsey. Tom realized that he was shivering and wondered if it was entirely due to the cold. He drew 2 fingers into his mouth and whistled a high-pitched note, then a lower one. It was a signal he had used often, although he still had no idea how Ratsey heard it, where he came from, or how he knew when someone was about to arrive. The town should have echoed through the trees, but on this damp, dreary night, the whistle sounded very small. Tom lifted his fingers again, then hesitated, as a second terrible howl rippled through the dark sky. It was a wolf. It couldn't be anything else. Tom! Tom! The piper's son! The voice was hushed, singing the words with a soft laugh. Tom turned around and almost cried out. A moment ago there had been no one there, but now there was a man, dressed in a long leather coat, with a sword at his waist. At least he was a man up to his neck. He had the head of some sort of horrible monster, with bloodshot eyes that bulged out of their sockets, yellow teeth as thick as organ keys, swollen cheeks like overripe melons, and a chin that curved around until it almost touched his nose. The man finished his song. Tom, Tom, the piper's son, will he stay or will he run? Tom relaxed, recognizing the voice. Ratsey! He exclaimed. Did I scare you, Tom? No. A shame. I meant to. Ratsey laughed, then reached up and grabbed hold of his chin. He pulled his entire face came away. His entire face came away. It was nothing more than an elaborate mask. The face underneath it was an unusually handsome one, with black hair sweeping over his forehead and almost touching the man's shoulders. His eyes, alight with humor, were pale blue, and the more he smiled, the brighter they seemed to shine. But for his sword, his leather coat, patched in so many places that there must have been very little of the original coat left, and his mud-spattered boots, you might have taken him for a priest or a choir boy. But then, if you had looked closer into those eyes, you might have noticed how very black his pupils were, and if at the moment he were to stop smiling, you would realize that this was a man who would never come near a church, unless it was to burn it down. What do you think of this new mask? He demanded. He held it up so that its pointed nose almost touched his own. It's horrible, Tom replied. Thank you. He set the mask down, and now tell me, what brings you out on this wet and wicked night? Tom swallowed. He knew that his next words would add up to a death sentence, but he had no choice. There's a man, he said. A traveler. Is he rich? Master Slope says he might be. Might be? Ratsey laughed and pulled a metal bottle from somewhere inside his coat. He unscrewed the lid, raised it to his lips, and swallowed. Tell me what you think. Tom, is he rich? I don't know, Ratsey. Ratsey considered this statement for a moment. He lowered the bottle and smacked his lips. He sighed. He sucked his teeth and then Before Tom could move, Ratsey lashed out, grabbing hold of the boy's ear and dragging him toward him with such force that Tom cried out with pain. "I asked you a question," he said in a reasonable tone of voice. "When I ask a question, I expect an answer. For that, my dear boy, is the point." "He is rich!" Tom shouted. He could feel his ear coming away from his head. "He has a horse, black with the white markings. His clothes are smart, and his purse is full." "Which way is he coming?" "The London road." "Excellent." Ratsey let go, and Tom reeled back, clutching his ear. Ratsey gazed at him apologetically, and handed him the bottle. "Here you go, my friend," he said. "Have a taste of that. Let it take away some of the cold." Tom hesitated, but Ratsey gestured, and so Tom raised the bottle to his lips. It contained some sort of brandy. The liquid burned his throat and sent tears to his eyes, but after the initial shock, he felt its warmth washing through his body, and he was grateful. "You know, I like you," Ratsey went on. "In a strange way, you remind me of me when I was young. Not, of course, that I was as scrawny and ragged as you. As a matter of fact, my father was a duke." He winked at Tom. "Strange to think that when I was your age, I ate off gold plates and had servants do everything for me." "So what happened, Ratsey?" Ratsey smiled. "I got bored, and I ran away. I went to war." He reached out, took the bottle back, and drank. For a long moment he gazed into the distance, and Tom could see the moon reflected in his eyes. "Captain Ratsey, that was me. I fought for the Queen, in Ireland, good old Queenie. I saw her once, you know. Tom. She was as close to me as a tree over there, as that tree over there." He nodded at the oak, and she turned to me. She turned to old Ratsey, and she smiled. "Glorious days." Ratsey was staring at the tree, with vague, dreamy eyes, and Tom had no doubt that he was once again seeing the Queen. And then times got hard. No money, no food, no fun. Ratsey jerked his head to one side, as if shaking off the memory, and suddenly he was businesslike again. "Tom, Master Slope, that the trap is set," he said. "I will be awaiting." "Yes, Ratsey." The conversation was over. Tom set off at once, scrambling across the clearing and back up the slope. When he reached the top, he stopped and turned around, but the clearing was already empty. Ratsey had vanished, and as quickly and quietly as he had first appeared. And the burned oak stood solitary, dead in the pale glow of the moon. It was still dark when Tom opened his eyes the following morning. In the summer months he would be woken by the sun breaking through the cracks in the walls of the stable where he slept. But in the winter it was the cold that did it. As he set to work, Tom thought about Ratsey and about the traveller who would be leaving for London that day. He knew what was going to happen. The same thing had been going on for as long as he could remember, but there was nothing he could do about it. It was no business of his. Tom had just finished cleaning out the hearth, the ashes thick with fat and grease, when he became aware of voices in the main room. The first high-pitched in anger and indignation. He knew at once it was Sebastian Slope. "You cannot take him," he was saying. "I will not allow it. You'll hang if you try to stop me." A moment later the door opened and I'm sorry, guys. "You'll hang if you try to stop me." A moment later the door opened and the traveller stormed in, already dressed in his cloak and with his sword buckled at his waist. Sebastian Slope was right behind him. The innkeeper had obviously gotten up in a hurry. He was wearing a dirty vest hanging outside his trousers. His eyes were bleary, and his orange hair was even more dishevelled than usual. The traveller ignored him. His attention was fixed on Tom, leaning by the hearth. "Tom," he said, "do you have any possessions? Anything you call your own?" "No, my lord." Tom was too dazed to understand what was happening. "Then you have nothing to pack. Come with me. We're leaving. Now." "But, my lord..." Slope had tried to bluster, and that hadn't worked, so now he began to whine. "My wife and I, where would we be without the boy? We've treated him like a son." "You've treated him like a slave, and believe me, you will hear more on it. You don't want him, my lord. Slope was actually... You don't want him, my lord. Slope was actually crying, but rather repulsively. The tears were coming out what was left of his nose. He's of no value to you. He's a sneak. He's a sniveler. If it wasn't for Miss S and me, he'd have been hanged years ago. Tell me, boy. The traveler was standing firmly between Tom and the innkeeper. Do you want to stay with this man and his wife? Tom wasn't sure what to say. He certainly had no love for either of the Slopes, but to leave, to step outside the small world of Framingham, it was something he had never even for a moment considered. He wants to stay, Slope exclaimed. He loves Miss S and me, like we was his own parents. No. Tom was amazed to find himself saying it. I don't want to stay. Then we will go. With his back turned to him, the traveler didn't see Slope snatch up a knife that had been lying on a table. Tom opened his mouth to call out a warning, but the traveler had no need of it. He must have heard something, for in less than a second, his sword was out of his sheath. He spun around and slashed down twice. The first stroke gashed Slope's arm, drawing a thin line of blood. The second sliced across his stomach, and for a horrible moment, Tom was sure it had killed him, but the blade had only cut through the waistband of his trousers. As Slope howled in pain, they slid down to his ankles, exposing a pair of knees like oversized walnuts. Follow me, Tom. Not sure if he was awake or asleep, Tom went with the traveler into the yard and watched as he saddled and made ready his horse. It didn't take him very long, as he led the animal out of the stable. He smiled at Tom for the first time. You have never ridden a horse, he said. No, my lord. It's not too difficult. Sit behind me and hold on to me. You'll soon grow accustomed. Where are you taking me, my lord? To London. London? London was a 4-day ride. Away, but for Tom it could have been on the other side of the planet, on the other side of the moon even. London was a city he knew, with a tower and a river and a cathedral so great that the church at Framingham could fit inside it. He had heard it said that crowds of people lived there, not just dozens but hundreds, maybe even 1,000. In silence he allowed the traveler to help him onto the horse. It was then that the door of the inn crashed open and Henrietta Slope emerged with a screech. Her husband was right behind her, half tripping over his trousers, which he was holding up with his good hand. What are you doing? She squealed. You have no right. I'll have the law onto you. I am the law, the traveler replied, and you have every reason to fear me. But although you don't deserve it, I'll play fair with you. He threw a handful of coins into the mud. This is for my room and board. Now be silent and let us pass. The traveler kicked with his feet, and the horse trotted forward. At the same time, Henrietta threw herself in front of it. Tom wasn't sure what happened next. The horse reared up, and he clung on for dear life. Henrietta fell back, losing her balance. With a great scream, she crashed to the ground, slapping into the middle of a pile of soft and steaming horse manure. Sebastian tried to help her, but with his trousers in a knot, he was too slow. The horse had left the courtyard. Tom and the traveler were gone. Henrietta Slope took her husband's hand and allowed him to pull her to her feet. She gazed down the road at the horse with its 2 fingers already vanishing from into the distance. Are you all right? Sebastian asked. Henrietta wiped a hand across the back of her leg. I stink, she exclaimed. I know, my dear, Sebastian agreed. But don't worry, the horse manure will hide it. He held up his hand, blood trickling between his fingers. He cut me, he complained. Henrietta looked at the blood, then back at the road. It's nothing compared to what Ratsy will do to him, she muttered. Ratsy, Sebastian had forgotten, but now an ugly light came into his eyes. He tore a piece of the bottom of his vest and wrapped it around his hand. You think he'll find him? He'll find him. Ratsy never misses. Henrietta's cheeks twitched as she tried to draw lips that weren't there into a triumphant smile. We'll have the boy back, aye, and that fine horse with him. And as for our brave traveler, dead meat, Miss S. Dead and buried, my beloved. And laughing softly to themselves, the The innkeeper and his wife turned and began to scavenge for the coins in the mud where they'd been thrown. End of chapter 3. Well, thank you guys for listening to this reading, and I can't wait to finish this book. It's the first one that I started off with, and I want it to be the first one I finish on this channel. Thank you guys for your support, and as always, stay comfortable. Goodbye.